Hi everyone, and welcome to another episode of Fun with Maps. I'm your host Dan Hanson, and today we're going to look at something fascinating. It's a country that's an archipelago. Now, an archipelago, if you don't remember from your school geography classes, it's a cluster of islands, it's a collection, a chain of islands, all clustered together, or it could be a sea that contains a small number of islands. So Japan is an archipelago. The Philippines are an archipelago. Hawaii is an archipelago. The Bahamas, the Canary Islands, the Aegean Islands, all those are archipelagos. And of course, the subject of this episode of Fun with Maps is an archipelago, Indonesia. Okay? In fact, Indonesia is the largest archipelagic country in the world. So we're going to zoom in on the map in a second here, but let me just tell you about archipelagos. It's derived from the ancient Greek, as so many words are. Archi means chief, pelagos means sea, so chief sea, archipelago. You can find them in isolated like this in large amounts of water, like the Philippines or Indonesia or Japan or something, or you can see them right off the mainland of a large landmass. So for example, in Scotland, Scotland's got more than 700 islands, believe it or not, surrounding its mainland. So that's an archipelago. So archipelagos will often have a lot of volcanic activity, and that's really the case with today's topic, Indonesia. In fact, Indonesia contains the most volcanoes of any country in the world. So let's zoom in a little on the map here. So I've got to be sitting down for this part because in this map, Indonesia is way at the bottom. We're at the equator here, so it's at the bottom. So, as I was saying, Indonesia is the most volcanic country in the world. There's got something like 76 active volcanoes here. You've probably heard of the historic volcano eruption Krakatoa, which we'll look at in a few minutes. So, the Republic of Indonesia actually has more than 17,000 islands. 17,000. Some you may have heard of, some of the bigger ones. So here's Sumatra. Okay. Here's Java. And there's the capital, Jakarta. Okay. Here's Bali. Probably heard of Bali. It's this little island to the east of Java. This is interesting. It's Borneo. It's actually an island owned by 3 different countries. There's the Indonesian part, there's the Malaysian part, Brunei has part, the Celebes. Over here, far east, is Papua New Guinea, which we'll see what part is New Guinea, which part is Papua. But all this area, this is Indonesia. And you can see, here's Malaysia, Thailand, coming down, Cambodia, Vietnam, Laos, all that. Here's the Philippines. Here's Singapore. So small, right at the tip of Malaysia here, so close to Sumatra. So Singapore is actually an archipelago too. It's this collection of islands there. So it's a fascinating area of the world. As we go farther west, we'll get into Oceania with Australia and New Zealand and some of those things, Guam and the Mariana Islands, things like that, which we'll look at some point. But for Indonesia here, the big islands, Celebes, Papua New Guinea, Borneo, Kalimantan, I think it's called locally, Bali, which you've heard of, Java, and Sumatra. And again, that's how close Singapore is there. So Indonesia is the world's largest island country. Just island. It's also the 14th largest of any kind of area. It's about 735,000 square miles. And Indonesia has almost 270 million people, making it the 4th most populous country in the world. When we looked at Wuhan, China, we saw how the comparisons there: China, India, U.S., Indonesia, Brazil, some of those most populous countries. So it's also the most populous Muslim majority country in the world. Okay, so Indonesia is primarily Muslim. There are Hindu sections and other religions, but it's primarily Muslim, and it's the most populous majority Muslim country in the world. The name Indonesia, no surprise, derives from the Greek Indus and Nasos, meaning Indian islands. So Indonesia, Indian islands. So half of the country's population, so that's like 145 million people, live in Java, and that's here. And like say, the capital is here, Jakarta. So half the people of Indonesia live on Java. And with all those people there, that makes Jakarta the second most populous urban area in the world. Now we've looked at, we've talked about Tokyo, Shanghai, Delhi. Jakarta here is the second most populous urban area in the world. And some of these things, the statistics, it matters how you define urban area or city or metropolitan area and all, but it's huge. So when you look at the map, you can see why Indonesia the archipelago has been such a force in trade. All these ocean routes, we've got the Pacific, we've got the Indian, all these things in between, Asia, Australia's over here. It's just been a force for centuries and centuries. And for most of the time, it was a Dutch colony. The French were there for a while, the British, the Portuguese, but mostly it's been the Dutch for like 350 years. And in fact, the concept of an independent nation state of Indonesia only came about in the early 20th century. So there were some rumblings about that and independence back there. And what really happened to spur that on was World War II. So when Japan in World War II invaded and then occupied Indonesia, that kind of ended the Dutch rule. Japan was there. The Dutch were pretty much out. And then when World War II ended, in fact, 2 days after the signing of the surrender of Japan in August of 1945, 2 days after that, a couple of leaders in Indonesia proclaimed Indonesia as independent, and they became appointed the president and the vice president. The Dutch didn't give up that easy. They still wanted to get back in. So for a few years, there were some armed conflicts and a lot of political problems and all, but eventually the Dutch kind of bowed to international pressure and backed off and recognized Indonesia as a separate country. So you can see it's along the equator here. So it's got, the climate is basically 2 seasons, a dry season, a wet season. It doesn't vary a lot. We have 4 seasons in a day here in Cleveland, Ohio, it seems. But they've just got the 2 seasons, dry and wet, and no extremes of summer or winter. So despite its large population and densely populated areas, like Jakarta here in Java, it's still got a vast areas of wilderness and all kinds of biodiversity, animals and plants that you don't see anywhere else in the world. The Sumatran rhino and tigers and all that. We'll touch on some of that. It's got a high level of biodiversity. So let's dive a little deeper into the map of Indonesia. We can draw some interesting connections with Johnny Cash and Monaco, and even that famous painting of the Scream. That's all got a connection to Indonesia, which we'll see in a minute in this episode of Fun with Maps.